The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in just a minute. First, as always, I wanted to check in and make sure that everyone can hear me and that everyone can see the screen and see the PowerPoint. So if you would just take a second in your chat box and just let me know that you can hear and that you can see so that we can take care of any technical issues on the front end. Wonderful. Thank you all. It looks like we're all hearing and seeing everything, so it seems like we're good this morning. We may have a couple more people get on the line, but that's just fine. We're going to go ahead and get started. I think that this morning is going to be fairly brief. This will be recorded. I will send the recording and certificate and everything out to you all as normal. But really what this morning is about is just kind of chatting about an overview of core concepts contained in the shelter manual, letting you all know what's there, why we created it, how it can be used, how we're supplementing the materials, all of those kinds of things. I hope that some of you have had a chance to at least look through the manual a little bit. I know it's long and I know that we're all busy and things have been a little hectic with many of you I know that I've been in touch with. So I know that you probably haven't had a chance to go through the whole thing because like I said, it is quite long, but I hope that you've had a chance to read a little bit and this is just, like I said, a little bit of an introduction. So when we initially set out to create the manual, we started it about 2 years ago. We started it in 2016 as part of our STOP grant funding through the Office of Criminal Justice Programs. And the mission of creating the manual and the point behind it was, and I know many of you have heard me say this, and many of you have been waiting, I think, with bated breath for the manual to finally come out because we've been talking about it for quite a while. But the mission behind it and the point behind it was that we have been talking for several years now, really, about the idea of trauma-informed care, right? About the concept of trauma-informed care and the theory behind it. But we haven't really gotten a whole lot past theory. You know, we can talk in circles about what trauma-informed care is and what the definition is and what the theory behind it is, but we hadn't really buckled down into practical how to implement, how to make it work, how to get past the challenges, how to evaluate the services, how to check in with staff. And so the mission behind creating the manual was to create something that was more than a theory, that it was more practical, that it was more actionable, that it was driven by the work that you do. And so part of the manual was pulling together folks from agencies across the state, from very large urban agencies, from very small rural agencies, to really help inform the manual. And part of that was not just us sitting around writing or talking about the theory. It was really having these agencies that were working through this process become, for lack of a better word, guinea pigs for a lot of what we were doing, because there's a lot of literature and there's a lot of best practices and even evidence-based information out there, but we wanted to know what it would look like in place, in action, in Tennessee and in different communities within Tennessee. So we met once, sometimes twice a month for almost 2 years, talking about best practices, talking about evidence, talking about research, taking back, sending back these theories and these ideas with the shelter program staff that were on the committee so that they could implement things in their shelters. And then they would report back about what challenges there were. Did things work? Did things not work? There were a lot of things that we tried that really didn't work and that didn't end up in the manual, but we wanted to explore all of the ideas and practices and things that were out there and available so that we could bring back to you something that was complete and vetted and hopefully really helpful and useful. And so we started from this idea that there are core principles in place that inform what trauma-informed care is and what it should be within our organizations. The idea that it realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands potential paths to recovery. Because over 70% of people living in the United States have experienced some kind of trauma. 70% is an astronomical number, and obviously I'm not saying that those 70% have necessarily experienced domestic violence or sexual assault, but they've experienced some form of trauma. Trauma is a widespread reality, and so it's something that, particularly for us working in this field where our job is to help bring safety and empowerment to victims of trauma, it seems to be at our core that we should understand the impact and recovery paths, that we recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in our clients, in the clients' families, in our staff, in others involved with us in the system. Because so much of what the broader world and media and culture looks at in the behavior of trauma victims and calls it problematic and calls it challenging and difficult and uses it to prop up victim blaming ideas are really some of the results of and symptoms of complex trauma. Right? Some of the ways that victims are disbelieved in terms of their stories being fragmented or them not remembering everything that happened to them in a period of violence. All of those things are trauma symptoms that are often used to blame the victims that we work with. And also equally important are the families that they bring in with them. There are studies that have shown that upwards of 50% of the folks living in shelters in any given year are children. And so the effects of trauma on these secondary victims and the effects of trauma on our staff, because we know that in this field, turnover is epidemic, right? Turnover is constant, and burnout is a huge problem. And so part of a trauma-informed agency is recognizing trauma symptoms of secondary traumatic stress within our staff and finding ways to handle that and to help them heal and care for themselves and ultimately reduce turnover and reduce trauma, and reduce burnout. And then fully integrating our knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And that is something that for a lot of the agencies I worked with and have worked with over the past couple of years, many times our policies and procedures are sort of the last things to change when we are trying to change the culture of our organizations. So I've worked with agencies that have had the same policies and procedures for a decade or more and haven't really reviewed and looked at and evaluated how those are truly working for our staff and for our clients. And finally, we're actively seeking to resist re-traumatizing survivors, right? And I cannot speak any more urgently or highly to our mission to prevent re-traumatization, because working through this system of shelter and court and orders of protection and hospital visits and rebuilding lives is traumatizing. It's truly traumatizing. It's a hard, hard journey. And so anywhere that we can seek to lessen or avoid re-traumatization is vital. And the other thing we looked at in creating this manual was core principles of trauma-informed culture. These core ideas that we should be bringing into our agencies and into our practices. And that is safety, trust, choice, collaboration, empowerment, and cultural competence. One of the core objectives of a trauma-informed agency is to reduce the power imbalance that exists between advocates and survivors. Advocates and administrative staff, you all are always going to have some degree of power over the survivors that you work with. You get to decide whether or not a survivor receives services. And by the very nature of your jobs, you have connections and resources that survivors may not have access to otherwise. So part of the empowerment piece and the choice and trust is finding ways to reduce this power imbalance by empowering survivors to direct their own experiences and lead their own healing journeys, right? And that is at the core, at the root of trauma-informed care, is empowering survivors to lead their own healing. And from that, we went into the actual creation of the manual with the idea of addressing three pieces, three branches of shelter operation. Physical operations and culture, which is the environment of the shelter that seeks to avoid re-traumatization. Support services that meet the unique individual needs of survivors and encourage a more empowered survivor-led experience of services. And then reduction of shelter rules and change and evaluation of policies and procedures to make sure that they're not duplicating power and control dynamics experienced by survivors. And so we wanted to make a manual that was practical, that was actionable, and that was useful to you all. And so one of the things that we looked at, and one of the things that we hope you all look at as you go forward and kind of use the manual as a tool to examine your agencies, are these three central questions. Does what we're doing respect a survivor's choices and encourage healing and empowerment? Does what we're doing help advance the accountability of individuals and groups to stop domestic violence? And does this change the conditions that allow domestic violence to happen in our communities? These questions place responsibility at the core of all shelter operations to further a mission of empowerment, accountability, and culture change. This helps you frame an organization's operations around these values and can help you undertake the process of self-evaluation that's necessary at all moments, at all levels of implementing trauma-informed care. There is no day, I think, where you say, okay, we've got it. We're 100% perfect. We're, everything we do is 100% amazing, and we're no longer going to evaluate our services from this point on. There's always more to learn. There's always more growth. There's always improvement that can happen. And the other thing that we really kept in mind was the potential for abusive power and control within the structure of the domestic violence shelter itself. Right? And you have all, I'm quite sure, have seen the traditional power and control wheel. And this particular wheel was created to examine the ways in which coercive control and power dynamics that are used by abusers can be mirrored within shelters. From intimidation, the arbitrary application of house rules and warnings, constant surveillance by staff because staff are always trying to catch that person doing something wrong because I know that, I suspect that they're doing drugs, or I suspect that they're drinking, or I suspect that they're doing this or that, and I just know that it's happening, and I just have to catch them, right? Emotional abuse, the presence of safety used manipulatively. Many survivors, if not most, already feel indebted or beholden to us when they come into our agencies because we are helping them or we are giving them some aspect of safety, and that if they don't follow our rules or if they don't play by what we tell them to do, that safety can be taken away. So that is profoundly distressing, and it's something that's very easy to even inadvertently use as leverage and as a power play against survivors. Isolation, restricted access to phones, curfews, forcing survivors to break ties with family and friends and community who are safe support systems. We're not talking about people who are, connections to the abuser, people who are potentially unsafe, but people who are safe support systems. Threats to call the child welfare system, requirements to attend parenting classes, punishing certain coping skills. So you can really see when you examine this power and control wheel, the reason why part of this push for trauma-informed care has also moved to a reduced rules model of shelter. Because so many things like curfews, chores, arbitrary house rules, arbitrary implementation of rules, requirements of what you have to attend or complete in order to stay in shelter, we're really mimicking an abusive level of control. And oftentimes, rules like this are enforced in a very biased way. You have a survivor who is bubbly and wonderful and interacts with the staff all the time and may do something that would have been against a house rule and may just get like a little warning or get a little talk about it or may never hear about it at all because she's a quote unquote good survivor, right? She's not problematic, she's not difficult, but you have somebody who you suspect has addiction problems or mental health issues, they're angry, they're surly, they don't want to go to class, they don't necessarily interact with advocates the way you think they should, and they may break the same rule as that quote unquote good survivor, and all of the sudden, this difficult survivor is the one who is held accountable or punished or exited from shelter. And so, what we're trying to do with rules or the lack thereof is move away from this biased and arbitrary application. So I've talked a whole bunch. So before I move on, I want to give you all a moment to ask any questions, share any thoughts that you may have about what I've talked about so far, or about the wheel, or what I've shown you. So I'm just going to give you a minute or so to type in your chat box and to let me know if you have questions, concerns, thoughts, feelings. If you agree or disagree, let me know. I haven't gotten any replies or any questions. I haven't gotten any replies or any questions, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. But if you do have a question or concern, the chat box is always open. I will be checking it periodically. So the other thing that we were seeing in the creation of the manual were several really common issues that we saw over and over and over, both in the shelters and agencies that are working on writing the shelters, and in the other shelters and the other agencies I was working with, were these common issues that folks were having in implementing trauma-informed care successfully. A lot of programs at that time called themselves trauma-informed, but maybe didn't have a full understanding of how to implement trauma-informed practices or how to fully commit to the organizational changes that are required for a trauma-informed framework. A lot of times agencies skipped the step of evaluating and changing internal policies and procedures, or struggled with inconsistent application in some key areas. The first one is lack of staff training. A lot of programs fail to ensure that all staff members receive training and support on implementing trauma-informed practices. You would sometimes just have one or two key staff members that were trained, but the rest of the staff didn't get that formal training. And so without consistent staff training and supervision, it's difficult to gain staff buy-in, which is the next kind of common issue, is that not having the buy-in from key staff, particularly staff who've worked in shelters for a long time, kind of prior to the application of trauma-informed care. Sometimes, not always, I don't want to generalize, but many times what we were seeing was those particular staff may be a little more resistant to changing a system that they are comfortable with or used to or perceive as working well. And then that kind of trickled down. Newer staff members would take their lead from the more seasoned employees. In the absence of consistent training, they would be confused as to how they were implementing, what their roles were, what best practices were. And that led to this inconsistent implementation, that programs would end up with some staff practicing trauma-informed care while others did not, or using trauma-informed principles in some areas of service while other areas of service remained really punitive and really rule-driven. And part of that, like we've explored, was lack of training, lack of buy-in. And part of that, too, is a lack of policies and procedures that reflect a trauma-informed organization, and a lack of evaluation and reflection on how we're doing as an organization. And then there is a lot of ideological differences that kind of surround this issue of creating a trauma-informed agency and what is trauma-informed culture and what does that look like. I've worked with some agencies that have voiced concerns that this approach means that clients don't participate in advocacy or support services, that it's more work for advocates, that there's a greater struggle with enforcing communal living norms like cleaning and quiet hours and curfew, that trauma-informed environments are less structured and therefore detrimental to survivors who need rules and structure. And then some agencies may just see trauma-informed care as ideologically different than the way shelters were run in the past. And this requires a shift in thinking about who might be a survivor and how they might best receive services. And the scary part, I think, for a lot of advocates, for a lot of people implementing this, is that to a degree, trauma-informed care takes some control out of the hands of advocates. It takes some of their control away and gives that control back to survivors. And this initial loss of control can be really scary for a lot of people. And it can cause some kind of reactionary pushback against this kind of rules reduction or trauma-informed model. And so that was another big part of why we wanted to really make this manual practical and applicable, to address concerns, to give guidance about encouraging client participation, to give guidance about healthy communal living, to give guidance about how you can provide structured services without these punitive rules, and creating more positive advocate-client interactions overall. And this is obviously something that I've mentioned and dug into a little bit, but organizations that are implementing trauma-informed care, no matter what stage of implementation they may be at, right? Whether you're at the very beginning stages or whether you feel like you're a seasoned professional at this point, must be prepared to consistently evaluate their services, to seek out feedback on survivors' experiences, to review policy and procedures, and resources have to be allocated to ensure that staff at all levels are receiving appropriate training and supervision. And I think it is so incredibly, vitally important that leadership is collaborating with sister agencies to discuss successes and challenges with implementation. That you are partnering with or collaborating with or just having coffee or phone calls occasionally with other leadership in other agencies that are implementing this too, so that you have somebody that you can bounce ideas off of, so that you have somebody that you can discuss challenges with and successes and what is working and what is not working. So I sent out a survey yesterday and I got some responses for you all. I sent it out to the group that had signed up to attend this webinar. Just asking you a few questions about what you needed more help with, or what areas you were struggling with. And I got some very similar answers. Most people picked a couple of very similar answers, but I want to take a second to kind of open it up a little bit before I kind of reveal what those couple of answers were. And I want to ask you, especially for those of you who were not able to complete the survey that I sent out yesterday, what areas of implementing trauma-informed care does your organization need the most help with? Things that maybe you're struggling with, or things that maybe just don't feel quite right. Maybe you just don't know exactly how to put your finger on it, but you feel like there's something blocking you in this particular area. And if you would take a minute to share that, if you want to, if you're willing to, and I will share your answers, but I won't share your names. So I won't share who said what. But if you would like to share, please take a moment to put it in your chat box and share with me. And I will give you just a minute to fill that out, and then we'll talk about it. And please don't worry if you didn't receive the survey or if you were not able to respond to it. I completely understand. We're all busy. It's very much not a big deal. It was just me checking in and kind of taking the pulse of you all to see kind of where to direct the conversation. So please don't be concerned that if you were someone who wasn't able to receive that. But so I've got a couple of people saying that they're really kind of struggling across the board in multiple areas. I have a couple people saying that training Staff training is a big concern. I'm going to give another second or two if anybody else wants to answer. Again, what areas of trauma-informed care is your organization having trouble with, or are you seeing barriers in? Okay, so really what you all are telling me this morning is very much echoing the two most common answers that I did get from the survey yesterday, which were the things that we're struggling with most seem to be rules reduction in rules within shelter, and lack of staff training. Those are two huge things. And somebody shared a really interesting one, which is our shelter is in a very small town, and staff tend to already know the person before they come into shelter. And that is a huge struggle. That is a really unique struggle that is unique to some of our smaller, more rural communities, that does make advocacy in general very difficult. And it ramps up some of the secondary trauma that is experienced by staff, and makes it harder to really have some of the hard conversations that are needed with implementation of trauma-informed care. But yes, that's reduction of rules and lack of staff training are the two biggest ones that I've seen. And those seem to be repeated over and over and over again. And I understand that. Those are two huge, huge barriers and struggles that I think are common, and that I don't want anybody who's experiencing these barriers or other barriers to be discouraged. I want you to know that implementation is not a straight line. It's not a race to the end. It is a slow process of change and evaluation and culture shift that takes time and investigation and seeing what works best at your organization. So the other question that I asked on the survey yesterday was, what is your biggest concern with the idea of trauma-informed care, or what areas of trauma-informed care do you find yourself disagreeing with? And you know what? It's okay to have concerns, and it is okay to disagree. But I think it's important that we can be honest and share and be talking about the concerns, because otherwise we have no real way to move past them. So if you want, I'm going to give you another second or two on your chat box. If you want to answer either of these questions for me, again, I'm not going to share who said what. That's private, and I'm not going to judge you or be upset, if you disagree with something, or if you're struggling, or if you have a concern. But I do, like I said, I want to know how you all are feeling and what you're thinking, because the more open and honest conversations we can have about this, I think the more that we can really start helping each other and talking out the issues and finding things that do work within your individual agency, because everybody's agencies and everybody's needs are different. So again, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to answer, and then I'll show you what was said most commonly in the survey. Okay, so one concern is active drug and alcohol use in shelter, and that is a very common concern. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's see. All right, I'm going to give about 10 more seconds, and then we'll see what the people wrote in the survey and talk about it a little bit. All right. All right, so the couple of things that were mentioned most in the survey were A, not being able to implement rules, the concern that trauma-informed care can be lax or enabling, which is echoed by, the concern that trauma-informed care may not give consistency and structure. And so I think these are all really common concerns, right? And they are some of the things, along with drug and alcohol use, that we really tried to buckle down and address through the course of the manual. The primary goal of the trauma-informed kind of rules reduction model is to create a less restrictive and more empowerment-focused environment. But that doesn't mean that rules don't exist within shelter. The framework forces shelters and other victim service agencies to consider what rules actually serve the safety and the security of clients, residents, and staff. And so it's less about making and enforcing rules and more about making connections and being willing to have hard conversations, right? Because, on one hand, maybe it's much easier to say, we have a rule that you have to clean your room every other day. And that rule is in place, and if you violate that rule, you may get a warning or you may get a strike or, whatever. And if you get so many strikes or so many warnings, you're out. But truly, what kind of message about control and empowerment does that send to a client versus having a difficult conversation and sitting down with a client and talking about communal living and responsibility and life skills, and cleaning is among those, right? And it's much more difficult. It's a much more draining interaction for the advocate to have, but how much more empowering, how much more equal is that type of model? And that's that's where we're trying to dig down to, right? And so unfortunately, I don't have time this morning in our short time together to really dig into all of the ins and outs of these issues, but I do want you to know that I hear you, that I really hear you about how hard it is. I really hear you about these struggles with alcohol and drug use, with rules, with consistency, with structure. And that's something that I hope that you all will reach out, and I hope that we can continue to have these conversations. But I don't want to leave you thinking only negatively or dwelling on only the challenges. I've worked with several agencies over the past couple of years really intensively. And the intensive work that I have been doing with them has been in large part really implementing trauma-informed services. And some of the feedback, this feedback doesn't happen right away, right? I mentioned that this is not a race. This is a slow process, but the feedback is important, I think, to that staff becomes excited. Staff asks for more training about trauma. Once you start talking about it a little bit, I find that they just really want to dig deeper and deeper. Trauma-related language is used more frequently in general discussions in staff meetings and supervision. And that is so powerful and so impactful. Staff becomes better able to recognize that the people they serve have experienced trauma and that their reactions and the way they're acting are based a lot on those trauma experiences and responses. Changes in attitude among staff since developing an understanding of trauma and its impact on survivors. Staff respond differently to survivors based on their knowledge of trauma, more flexible, more non-judgmental, more patient. Being trauma-informed is a process. It involves gradual integration of trauma concepts and trauma-sensitive responses, and it looks different for programs depending on their size, structure, culture. But I want to leave you knowing that programs that have really set out and embarked on this journey, when they've gotten deep into it and when they've really started evaluating, have found new strength and new inspiration and renewed energy. And I think that for me has really helped me keep going over the past couple of years, and over what many of you know and have heard has been such a long process with this manual, because I've seen the real true change and the real impact that this has made on survivors and on staff and on agencies. So I'm not going to leave you hanging out on your own. I want you to know that there are lots of things that I'm here and the coalition as a whole is here to help you with. That I am committed, like 100% committed to supporting you through this process, through the challenges, through the concerns, through the struggles, through the things you disagree with, through the times that you want to yell at me and you're so frustrated. I want to be there to support your process and your staff's process and your client's process through all of this. And the manual is a big part of that. And these continued conversations that we have scheduled about the manual that will dig deeper than just this introductory one today are a part of that. But also, in addition to those two things, we have scheduled shelter institutes throughout 2018 in East Tennessee, in Morristown on May 15th and 16th. In Jackson in West Tennessee on June 26th and 27th, and in Nashville on July 24th and 25th. These institutes are based on the manual. They dig deeper. They involve a lot of interaction, a lot of conversation, a lot of practical work and practice. And a lot of open forum to really ask questions. I always bring in not just myself, but the other folks from the agencies who were on the committee who are involved in writing the manual are always there as well, so that they can really give their perspectives on what it looks like to implement these things in a program, what challenges they've faced, what successes that they've had, that they can help, that we can help brainstorm, that we can really dig deeper and talk about this in person. And not only those shelter institutes, but I hope that you all know that the coalition offers individual training and consultation, whether it is one-on-one with an executive director or board members, whether it is coming in to your agency and doing training for your staff specifically. And I know that that is something that's been really helpful for many agencies to be able to have me come and work with their staff directly at their agency. They're not having to, have folks who are out of the office. They're not having to worry about travel for their staff. They're not having to do any of those things. So it can be training on anything from the impact of trauma to supporting resilience to cultural competency to rules reduction to communal living, to consulting and helping you all have conversations about peer support, or to helping you create trauma work groups within your organization that can continue on this great work independently within your organization, to helping you establish external support networks, to working with you to review and revise policies and procedures, to having conversations about organizational wellness and burnout, and roundtable discussions with staff about organizational wellness. I can help you. I know sometimes, they're hard conversations that are difficult for us to have with our staff, and that sometimes it's easier to have an outside person who's maybe there just to facilitate. And I'm more than happy to help you with any of those kinds of things. And I also provide, which you may not be aware of, is a really holistic trauma-informed organizational assessment where I work with leadership to assess your entire organization, from policies and procedures to staff to physical space, environment, culture, and we work on making a plan that is individual for your agency. What training, what consultation, what conversations, what support do you need? That is really individual to you, because like I said, we understand that every agency is different. So I want to be here for you and for that. There was a question of will we be talking about the same information at each shelter institute? Yes and no. So the shelter institutes will have they will each have the same kind of agenda. But a huge part of the institute is very self-led by the attendees. Like I said, it becomes a lot of questions and conversation, and the bulk of the institutes are asking questions, talking about issues that whoever is in attendance is having. So they all look a little bit different in terms of what conversation is had, but the bulk of the other content, the activities and things are the same. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. But I also want to say, if you're interested in any of this, in the institutes, in the individualized trainings, in the trauma, the organizational assessment, any of that, I think most of you know how to contact me by now. I think I've worked with almost all of you at some point or another, but here is my information. Here's how you get a hold of me. Please note on my email that there are 2 H's, 2 R's, and 2 N's. That is not a typo. That's just the fact that my name is weird. And so make sure you put in all those double letters or it won't come to me. But please don't hesitate to get in touch, and even just to even if you just need to vent, even if you've just had a really challenging day, or a really challenging client, or a really challenging situation, and you don't even need me to solve it, you just need to vent to someone, I'm here for you 100%. So I hope you all reach out. If there's ever anything that I can do, I'm here to support you in this process. So thank you so much. Thank you for being on today. Thank you for being willing to have these conversations and dig into this process. I really appreciate all of you so much. Um, and so thank you. And I will talk to you soon, I am absolutely sure. I will also send out a recording of this and send out a certificate for all of you this afternoon. So don't worry about that. All right, everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll talk to you soon.